This week, Yoni Shohet from Valence Security joins us to talk about SaaS Security. Then Theresa Lanowitz from AT&T and Chris Goettl from Ivanti are with us to discuss security's role in edge computing. Finally, in the enterprise security news, Ali Mellon joins us to discuss Cisco's massive Splunk acquisition and to discuss her thought-provoking essay on the blob that's poisoning the security industry. There was air quotes in there for the audio listeners. Depending on how much time we have after that, we might talk about funding from Dragos, Legit Security, Alcyon, Stoke, Rocket Chat, and Discern Security, and also acquisitions made by WatchGuard and Demotes. More Palo Alto acquisitions rumors. This time it's Dig Security, new tools and products, CISO budget struggles, and situations where security awareness vendors are more likely to maybe cause harm than to help. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
If your organization is ready to embrace edge computing, we have good news. The 2023 AT&T Cybersecurity Insights Report provides everything you need to know to get started. In the report, we identify the common characteristics of edge computing. We found edge use cases are rapidly coming online, and we reveal how to secure edge computing. Most importantly, you'll learn how to prepare for your edge ecosystem. Get your complimentary copy of the report today. Visit securityweekly.com/ATT Cybersecurity. That's securityweekly.com/ATT Cybersecurity. The cybersecurity landscape is full of single solution providers, making it easy for unexpected cyber threats to sneak through the cracks. That's why Fortra is creating a stronger, simpler strategy for protection, one that increases your security maturity while decreasing the operational burden that comes with it. This is all possible thanks to Fortra's best-in-class portfolio and deep bench of expert problem solvers. Fortra's integrated, scalable solutions help customers face their toughest challenges with confidence. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra, Fortra. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Drink Beer Day. This is episode 333, recorded on Thursday, September 28th, 2023. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the czar of Zero Trust, a captain of content, and a top cybersecurity influencer, Katie Teitler. How are you, Katie?
I'm good, Adrian. Thank you for that creativity in my intro, just teeing me up for a snarky post coming up soon. But happy Drink Beer Day to you.
Yeah, and it is National Drink Beer Day. I don't know why it's September 27th, but that's what the crazy days of the year calendar told me it was. So that was the most interesting one of the 5 today.
It's the 28th, so hopefully you weren't beer goggling the National Calendar Day.
Yeah, correct. Thank you for correcting me. But
I just wanted to make sure we were on the right day.
Yes, we are on the right day, and that is today. It was not pulled from the 27th. Today really is National Drink Beer Day. Not that
you just had a few too manys and didn't.
No. Just
that's later.
Just got a lot rolling around in my head, which is why I partially have a script to kick me off with this podcast. All right, quick announcement, then we'll jump into our first interview. As a member of the Security Weekly community, we are pleased to offer you 50% off your AIDC 2023 tickets using code CRA50OFF, CRA50OFF. Join us on October 4th, 2023 in Pentagon City. ICIT, the nation's #1 cybersecurity think tank, brings together America's leading minds to discuss AI's impact on the country. Register today at securityweekly.com/AIDC 2023. All right, and today's topic is SaaS security. We're excited to have Yoni Shohet, CEO and co-founder of Valence Security, with us today. He is ex-Israeli Defense Forces. This is his second startup. And full disclosure, he's also my boss at Valence. Welcome. How are you doing, Yoni?
Hey, Adrian, it's great to be here. I feel too bad that I only have water and not beer, but it's great to be here.
Yeah, right. Should have warned everybody that was there was going to be a theme for the show today. So, the way this came about, a lot of our shows, I kind of dig into new markets, trying to understand them. And one of those that we've talked to, I think 3 times. I think we've talked to 3 separate companies, 3 separate founders on DSPM. And I realized we haven't really had anybody on to talk about SSPM. And, since I happen to work for an SSPM vendor, made a lot of sense because that's my context for understanding this market is through the company that I work for. So it made sense to have you come on, Yoni. And it's, honestly, I don't think this category gets enough coverage because we all use SaaS. It has become ubiquitous in our personal lives, in our work lives. And it seems kind of odd to me that we're just now, SaaS security is just now becoming this emerging market where there's this heavier focus on SaaS security. So I guess that's going to be my first question here is, a bit of a 2-part question. Why now? Why the emphasis on SaaS security just now and not maybe 10 years ago, right? Like Salesforce went public in 2004. SaaS has been around for a long time. And then why did you personally choose SaaS for your second startup?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think that obviously SaaS is not new. SaaS has been with us for the past couple of decades at least. And after the first wave of SaaS adoption, we've seen the emergence of CASBs, cloud access security brokers, in maybe about a decade ago. And we've seen also a lot of acquisitions of these vendors. And at that time, SaaS was maybe adopted in organizations, maybe had a dozen of core SaaS applications within each organization. And the SaaS applications themselves were very narrow, very focused on specific purposes. And over the past few years, what we've seen is 2 things. One is that SaaS have evolved to become much more complex platforms. Today, Zoom, even what we're using now for recording this podcast, then Zoom itself is now a platform that allows you to share data externally, to record calls, to add third-party apps, to add extensions. You can manage different users. You can leverage it to perform a lot of different actions. It has a marketplace to extend the value to addition ecosystem players. So the complexity of SaaS application has grown significantly over the past few years as SaaS has become much more mainstream. And the second aspect is that SaaS is everywhere, and SaaS is being adopted by everyone all the time. It's as easy as just setting up user credentials, clicking sign in with Google or Microsoft, spinning up a tenant, creating a new account. And usually the administration of SaaS applications today within organizations is not only by IT and security like it traditionally was, but it's now across the board. You have Salesforce admins in the sales and marketing or the revenue departments. You have GitHub admins in the development and R&D development departments, Workday admins in HR, and so on and so on. And basically what we're seeing is that the complexity of SaaS applications and the distributed ownership of SaaS applications combined are today challenges for security teams to actually control and manage the posture of all these different SaaS apps and ensuring that eventually the data, the permissions, the capabilities, the processes that they host sometimes are properly secure and not exposed due to a lack of hygiene, lack of knowledge of what is a secure configuration, and so on.
Yeah, and you mentioned CASB. It seemed, I covered that pretty closely in my time as an industry analyst, and it seemed like the focus was still very much allow, not allow. To a lot of them were in line. So it was still very much this kind of blocking mindset that security used to have, and you'd see things like you could take away features, or you could, add additional security controls. By taking away JavaScript and adding JavaScript in line to the DOM. And, It seemed like that combined with, hey, let us show you every single, all 1,000 SaaS that your employees are using, even if only one employee created an account once, it seemed like that approach didn't really stick. I haven't seen a whole lot of adoption on the enterprise side. And now it just seems like when you look at Netscope, which is one of the, probably one of the first and probably the most funded CASB of all time, CASB only shows up as one of its 13 products today. It touts itself as more of a SSE or a SASE these days. So, do you think, did you have the benefit of hindsight there? And there's still the question, why did you choose SaaS security and maybe not DSPM or one of these other emerging categories?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the CASB vendors are now merging or have already merged with secure web gateways and SWGs and with a zero trust network access in order to create really that SSC or SASE category, depending if it has SD1 or not. And basically applying zero trust access controls across all enterprise resources, regardless of whether or not there are SaaS applications. But today, even if you look at the traffic that goes between the end user and the SaaS application, it's typically not enough. Because what we're seeing today, attackers leverage is really the complexity of these SaaS applications. So one of the most popular attack methods that we see over the past couple of years is leverage of third-party integrations, OAuth tokens, API tokens, or basically these non-human identities between SaaS applications, and how today it's very easy for business users to extend, let's say, GitHub to an additional SaaS application just by creating an API token and providing that API token to that third-party vendor. This entire communication between these two applications doesn't go through enterprise resources. Therefore, all the CASBs, SSEs, SASEs don't really control and manage those communications. And monitoring and managing these configurations has become key in order to really ensure that you have a strong enough security posture. And what we've seen and through our ideation process and why we eventually decided to start Valence is that when we spoke with a lot of security teams, they were the perception was, I got an IDP, an identity provider that enforces single sign-on and MFA, and it ensures strong authentication to my SaaS apps, and therefore I'm secure. But the reality is that even if you have the strongest authentication between your users and your SaaS applications, the amount of third-party vendors, external collaborators, and mistakes your business users can make in this entire access world that is not governed by your identity provider is so significant that at the time it seemed like a good area to focus on because it was just underserved. And we've seen the initial cases of attacks. So I think I always joke that security companies are sometimes like mushrooms after the rain, which is a frame like something we say a lot of times in Hebrew. And basically after the SolarWinds attack campaign, one of the techniques that attackers used is that they leverage tokens that were generated for third-party vendors and leverage these tokens that were just not monitored to gain access to core SaaS applications, mostly Microsoft 365. And from that aspect, and seeing that today this is really an underserved and underlooked area, we decided to really focus our company on securing these SaaS applications and against modern risks that are related to the complexity of these configurations. And over time, it evolved to more and more capabilities that really allowed today eventually security teams to understand the risks and also apply the proper remediation actions to decrease the risk. And I think obviously there are always great opportunities in the cybersecurity world. That's why we're seeing so many new companies started and so many acquisitions and funding. But I think also obviously it's tightly related also to the DSPM space, because eventually the promise of DSPM is you don't know where your data is, and you need to make sure that you have proper controls to protect your data. And this primarily focuses on IaaS and infrastructure as a service and SaaS, so apps like OneDrive, SharePoint, Google Drive, and even apps that you don't think about, like NetSuite has the ability to host documents and share them externally. Same goes for Salesforce, Zoom, GitHub. almost every SaaS application today allows you to host data on it and to share it with external collaborators. And this is very well tied to also the DSPM world, but more focused on the SaaS prisma rather than the data prisma in terms of how we try to address and tackle these issues.
So a few minutes ago, you brought up one of the biggest problems that I think there is today with SaaS applications. It's that security people know the inherent risks. They can identify the vulnerabilities. They can identify when there are problems. But have you also found that part of the problem and part of the complexity is that a lot of times security isn't involved with SaaS application, either procurement, deployment, or usage at all? I mean, I've certainly seen that, but you're more in this space, so I'm curious as to your experience with how you handle that, the different business owners of these things and managing them from a security standpoint, but also operational efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, it's funny. When we started Valence, we had a very specific vision on certain technology tools that we wanted to build for this space. And after we did our first risk assessment for our first customer, we gave them a list of all the third-party integrations that they needed to manage within their Microsoft 365 environment. And there were a few hundred integrations there. And we went over the list, and almost every single entry there, the CISO told us, I don't know what this is. I need to go ask him. I don't know what this is. I need to go ask her. I don't know what this is. I need to go ask. I need to go ask. I need to go ask. And almost at that point, we realized that just showing the visibility and telling the security teams, hey, here's another list of problems that you're not going to solve because you have no idea why they were created in the first place, and it will be easier for you not to touch them and not to know about them, rather than to see this long list of problems and see this red dashboard that we can build. We incorporated into our platform the ability to collaborate with the business users, meaning eventually there's a very simple question that security teams want, or questions that security teams want to ask business users, and we can automate that process through Slack bots or email bots or whatever the platform is, in order to communicate and collaborate with the business users, collect from them the context, and provide that to the security team in an automated way, in order to allow eventually our remediation capabilities to automate the processes and to eventually to lead to risk reduction. And what we found out is that eventually the business users and the business admins, they want to make sure that their platforms are secure, because they know it's also their liability, because shared responsibility is not just between the business users or the customer and the vendor, but it's also between internally between the different business units. And what we found out is that eventually when you provide the right context, the right explanation to the relevant people, they either give feedback, provide the missing business context, or take the right action to the remediation. And that's where kind of our collaboration and automation and remediation come together in order to facilitate a decision-making process that usually has a human in the loop. But the beauty is that the human in the loop doesn't need to be from the security team. It can be from the business unit, because they know why they connected app X to, or Gong to Salesforce, for example. They know why they did it, and they know if they don't need it anymore, or if it's something that they're just evaluating and forgot to remove, or something like that. So that building that platform that allows you to communicate and collaborate with the business users, and also to explain and create a common language between security and business units, is a key to enable that, eventually, that path towards risk reduction.
Now, I know Adrian has another question coming up, but I'm going to step in here just for a second, Adrian, and follow up on your question, or on your comment, because I'm curious as to whether this awareness, because awareness is great, but it's the foundation, right? You see what you've got, you let the business owners know. But have you seen the visibility aspect actually affect the management of these SaaS apps, or the responsibility for these SaaS apps? In other words, is getting non-security people involved in governance of SaaS apps helping people understand the risks and then manage it? So is there sort of a chain of responsibility that's coming with that, or are we still super early in the process?
So what we see is, for example, one of our recent onboarding, The first thing the security team did is they onboarded the Salesforce admin with read-only access to the Valence platform to see all their security misconfigurations. And what that admin focused on in the first 3-4 weeks of the platform is to make sure that they increase the risk score, reduce the risk score from 23% of past security configurations to 83%. And the main reason they were able to do that is because they received a very well digested in Salesforce terminology of what's the misconfiguration, how they can fix it, and how to go and perform it really in the Salesforce platform. And that allowed the security team, all they had to do is only to provide them access to a platform that explained to the business users, or in this case to the business admins, what to do. And this creates that culture of collaboration where the business admins are the ones that are making the change and making the fixes, and the security team are governing it with the right policies and guardrails, saying, hey, you can run fast. And maybe to Adrian's point earlier, we don't want to block all your features in SaaS applications, because otherwise, why are we using them? Let's enable the SaaS applications and their features, but let's ensure that we have the proper guardrails, or that at least we make conscious decisions on what we enable and what we disable. And that once that's done together and done in shared visibility and shared platforms, then that creates the proper trust. So nobody needs to block anything, and that eventually the business user can be as most productive as possible by leveraging the most innovative tools.
Yeah, so that's you talked about making it a conscious decision. Yes, this is configured this way, not out of not because we haven't looked at it, because we haven't touched it yet. We don't even know that configuration is there, but we intend it to actually be configured this way. Yeah, I wonder if you've seen some particularly bad or head-scratching default configs that everybody should just go into this particular SaaS app and change it. Like, it doesn't make any sense for it to be, or most people are surprised when they see that this is the default configuration. Do you have any examples there?
Yeah, so for example, when we developed our Zoom connector, we scanned for external recordings that are shared with anybody with a link. They included a passcode, but this passcode is embedded in the link that you send out anyhow. And apparently the default setting is that when you record or at least in our tenant, it was the default setting, when you record a session on Zoom, it's automatically shared with anybody with a link. So it's not shared only with the participants, it's not shared with access controls, it's shared with anybody with a link, with a password, but it's shared with anybody with a link, which was pretty surprising, because when we developed it, I started to reach out. So we obviously eat our own dog food or drink our own champagne and use Valence internally. So we looked at it and we said, oh, look at all our salespeople. They recorded a bunch of calls and now they're sharing it with anybody with a link. Why would they share that? And then they just said, we didn't do anything. This was by default. It was very surprising to see that was kind of the default settings and the default configurations.
Yeah, especially considering the password. I mean, might as well not have a password if the link is the password, right? It's like having the name of the resource also be your encryption key, right?
Yeah.
And also, I kind of want to dive into, the market, some experiences selling this product, what you're seeing. You talked about one of the aha moments with the very first customer being just that visibility, specifically into integrations. Where are people generally in the market? Are they aware that SaaS security is something they should be worried about, and they're just deferring it and choosing not to tackle it yet? Or, are people still very much unaware of the level of misconfiguration and issues that there can be in SaaS?
So I think the awareness is quite there. We're starting to see a lot of large organizations with active SaaS security projects. I think maybe the biggest challenge for security teams is also, to our point earlier, is that it's hard for them to define a clear ownership for who needs to tackle it, even within the security team. If we refer, for example, to DSPM, then DSPM is usually assigned to the data security team, if there is one. And I think SaaS security can be in between different types of ownerships within the security teams, and sometimes even they try to defer to the business technology or the IT team. But I think the awareness and understanding that SaaS risks are real, especially with the rise of also MFA fatigue type of attacks, where I have one of our customers told us that they did a pen testing, a social engineering pen testing process, and one of the things that the pen testers did is that they texted some of the employees a message saying, "Hey, you're now logging in from London. Can you please provide us your 2FA so you can log in?" And employees just shared their 2FA. They went into the app and they shared the 2FA. And then the security team asked them, "Why did you do that?" And they said, "Oh, we have an office in London, so we thought it makes sense for us to do that." And I think that the awareness today that these types of attacks, and we're seeing very high-profile breaches that typically originate with somebody got an access token, whether if it's a human or a non-human access token, to a SaaS application, Okta, Microsoft 365, Slack, Google, GitHub, whatever it is, and that leads to eventually to either the initial access or to access to the most core and sensitive data within the organization, is bringing the awareness to the right place. And it's mostly the security teams trying to figure out from an operational perspective, how do they create the right structure so they can manage and run it within the organization.
Yeah, and you mentioned what we've seen from breaches. Another thing that we tend to see in breaches forever is the lack of visibility. The new domain admins are created, nobody notices. Antivirus is disabled, nobody notices. And we tend to see that in SaaS as well. We've seen global admin cases where global Google Workspace admins and Microsoft 365 admins were created. And a month later, nobody had noticed those kinds of things. And there are other vendors in this space that kind of started with like a detection and response focus, whereas ours is more Valence's is more governance, hygiene, understanding your configurations and what's currently there. How important do you think that is, and is that how hard a problem do you think that is to tackle, the actual detection and response piece of this?
Yeah, so I think the detection and response, in order for it to be effective, and this is why we also saw it for other plays that we've seen in the industry, not only in SaaS, context is king or queen. And without having context for the detection and the events that you see, it's very difficult to ensure that you're able to remediate and resolve the issues that you detect. So being able to detect and understand, hey, somebody did something weird without understanding the context of who is somebody, what are they, what else did they do, what are they doing at other platforms, and correlating all that information is very, very difficult. And unfortunately, a lot of detection and response tools are very noisy in terms of what they're able to detect. For example, we spoke about CASB, so impossible travel is CASB 101, and it's probably one of the most hated features that we've seen within security platforms. But I think that with the proper context and proper understanding of this is the bigger picture and this is the event, these are the events that are related to it, it really helps the detection and response to be more effective, more targeted, and probably also with less false positive, at least from our experience. When you combine that with the proper context, that allows you to eventually tackle the most urgent or important aspects, because there's a difference. For example, if an EDR detected that my endpoint was compromised, there's a difference between if I'm a Salesforce admin or not, right? It changes how I address that risk. So combining the posture and the configurations with the detection and response provides a lot of value from what we're seeing within organizations.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like you're talking about before, we've got an office in London, that's probably fine. Maybe the fact is during some of these breaches, they did see some of the activity, and because they don't have that context, they see a login from London, they think, we've got an office in London. Maybe that's fine. Maybe they are seeing the attackers and just explaining it away as something normal in their environment because they don't understand enough about the context surrounding those activities, those events.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So, so we've talked a lot about, I mentioned DSPM early, is another interesting category that we've talked about on here. We haven't talked about ASPM that much, and we're starting to see some consolidation in the industry. I think we saw an ASPM acquired last week. There's a rumor this week about Palo Alto maybe being interested in Dig. And CSPMs have been around for a while now. Some of the largest cybersecurity companies are now, I guess they're branding as CNAPs. But with all the posture management here, what does the future of the market, do you think, look like? Do we have one posture management for everything, or is the split between SaaS and cloud, and who cares about those areas? And you mentioned if you have a data security department, they're going to be the ones managing DSPM. Does it make sense for these tools to remain separate, or do you see some consolidation happening here?
Yeah, so I think if we look at the equivalent in the detection and response space, right? So we had EDRs, NDRs, and a bunch of DRs that eventually consolidated into XDR because it targeted the same persona that needs to detect and respond to these threats. In SPM or XSPM, to your point, it's not always the same persona, but the events are related. So if I have a user that has too much access to data, and they're also an admin in my AWS and also an admin in my Microsoft 365, then these three data points are obviously interesting, the correlation between them. But I don't want to go to my SSPM, my CSPM, and my DSPM and to see all that data points together there. So the correlation between XSPM's data points is interesting. I'm not sure if it's going to be through a consolidated platform, because I think there are different buyers and operators for each one of these platforms. But I think through maybe integrations where, let's say, for example, we connect to a CSPM and we pull from there the connecting tissue, which is the identity aspect, and we see through the identity how the user that we see or the account that we see on our SSPM is related to also the risk score or the posture element in the cloud infrastructure or in data or in different aspects, could create an interesting correlation. Same goes for if you look at the triangle of ASPM, DSPM, and CSPM. There's an app, it runs on a cloud, it has access to data. It needs to be eventually correlated. And that's why you see in certain aspects, let's say CSPMs that claim that they have DSPM components built into them. So you don't need another dedicated tool. I assume we'll see the same thing with ASPM and CSPM and DSPM. So we'll see maybe consolidation through certain aspects of these capabilities, but there is justification for the personas that it's targeting to have a more dedicated approach for the risk posture management of each one of these risk surfaces.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because like with Microsoft 365 and Azure, I feel like the line is very blurry between the two. In fact, sometimes when we see these, we're analyzing these breaches and how they happened and trying to determine, is this something that SaaS Security could help with, or is this more of a CSPM, CNAP type of situation? Honestly, sometimes I have to go to our product team, to our research team, and ask them, like, what side of the line does this fall on? Because a lot of times you're using the same identities in both places, right? Like the identity you're checking your email with, you might also be doing some engineering in Azure with.
Yeah, definitely. So I think especially in the Microsoft ecosystem, you have Entra ID, or formerly known as Azure ID, as kind of the connecting between multiple different elements, including the cloud infrastructure, the SaaS apps, and different elements. And managing the security of that connecting element is critical to secure each one of the components within your whatever the SPM is, or whatever the cloud service is.
Yeah, and that's kind of tricky, right? Like, because everything is SaaS. Like, if I log into the AWS console, that's SaaS. If I log into the Azure's console, our own product is SaaS, right. And most security products are, like we've seen the Tenables and Rapid7s, like even the vulnerability managers. Yeah, they might have a scanning engine on-prem somewhere, but the product itself is all SaaS. So, where does it begin and end? What do we protect or not protect with like a SaaS security tool?
Yeah, so I think unfortunately it doesn't end. That's the issue, right? So even if you try to create like a clear borderlines, and then you look at something like Microsoft Power Platform, right? So Microsoft Power Platform, the identities could be managed in the Azure AD, but Microsoft Power Platform could have tokens to anywhere, even to other SaaS applications. And then you have automated processes and machine to machine and automated activities that you need to start managing that are related to how you eventually manage your SaaS app. So I think when you look at the combination between human identities, non-human identities, and the different configurations, then typically the attack path between all these different SaaS services is endless, and you need to manage it as if there's a continuous process that runs between all these different SaaS applications.
Which is why you might see Valence announcing some partnerships with some other companies here, right?
Could be, yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, so just talking about like getting the product up and running. The challenge of we were talking about bringing in the Salesforce admin, giving them read-only access so they can see and they can improve the security score, the configuration score. How big of a challenge is that for the security team to go out, find those stakeholders, get them to, because in a lot of these cases, it's somebody outside of IT, somebody outside of security that has to actually connect up their SaaS to Valence's product, right? How much of a challenge is that, especially, if you've got clients up in the dozens of apps that they're connecting in here?
Yeah, so it depends on the SaaS app. Some are very easy, and obviously on the organization. Some is more difficult, or some are more difficult. But I think the forward-looking organizations, typically you see close collaboration between these teams that allow them to work together to create a better process and guardrails for the business units to use the best-in-class tools. Obviously, it's more challenging if before looking at a platform that does SaaS security, if the security team never spoke with the Salesforce admin, then there's a challenge. But typically what we see is that there was already some kind of an attempt. Whether if it was successful or not, that's a different case. But they do see that our platform could be that base communication knowledge and the ability to communicate with the same terms between the different SaaS, between the different owners within the organization.
And something else that seems like a challenge, just talking about how different SaaS apps can be. Some SaaS apps might have multiple APIs, for different parts of the applications, or maybe they have multiple applications. They might have a lot of API endpoints, and different things you can do with the API or within the product, or they might have just a few. How difficult is it with each SaaS app being unique and no normalization between the SaaS apps, even on how they handle something simple? Like I've seen some SaaS apps where enforcing MFA is a 2 or 3 step process. There's a couple different configuration things you need to check, and with others, it's literally just a single checkbox. How much of a challenge is it just determining like how much work it's going to take to build these connectors? Was the second group of 5 SaaS apps easier to build for than the first 5, for example?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning, you need to understand what's the data structure and what's the common elements between the different SaaS applications. But understanding how that data structure relates to every different SaaS application is a challenge that you need to make sure that you continuously reassess, because every SaaS application has its own terms, its own permission model. They hide the same capabilities, legacy capabilities across different platforms. So there are certain applications where we're seeing, let's say, for example, 7 different ways to create third-party integrations. Now, why would a SaaS application need 7 different ways? Because they started with one for a specific purpose, then they bought another company, embedded it into the platform, and then they had a different authentication method, and they created kind of a complex structure that eventually tries to simplify the user experience for the business users and the end users, but creates a complex structure for security teams to enforce security controls and to ensure that they apply the proper security measures. So I think that the short answer is that every SaaS application is a world of its own, and you need to be able to support it and to understand its in depth. And that's kind of the value that we see a lot of times that customers come to us and say, hey, listen, we're not experts in platform X. We need you to explain to us what we need to know about platform X. That's why we have a team of security researchers that day in, day out look into these different platforms and look for issues and look for opportunities for security teams to improve their security posture by leveraging the native controls, because that's eventually what you're dependent on, right? If it's a SaaS application, all you can do is turn on and off controls that the SaaS app has exposed and provided you. You can't build or modify or change aspects that are not deliberately configurable by the SaaS application vendor.
Yeah, and you mentioned something earlier, like when the Salesforce admin is looking at the findings in the product, it's speaking their language, right? Like if you do have an administrator, that's in as deep a world as like Salesforce, is an entire career. Like you can have an entire career of just configuring Salesforce and running Salesforce for people, and you've got to speak their language. So that's it seems like that's kind of key here. Like you can't use the Microsoft name for API keys when you're talking to a Salesforce person, and vice versa if they refer to those things with different terms.
Right. We even try to leverage generative AI and OpenAI, and we have it embedded in our platform. So if there are, let's say, security configurations that are too complex, either for business admins because they don't understand the security terms, or for security teams because they don't understand the native SaaS application terms, then they can leverage the power of Gen AI to get better answers and explanations about why they should care and why something matters within SaaS applications.
Yeah, and I guess my last one of my last questions here is where does it go from here? Because there are one of the things that CASBs did first off, which I think hurt them, is they tried to discover as many SaaS apps in use as possible, which to me, from a CISO or a security leader perspective is pretty overwhelming. Like I don't want to go from thinking I have 12 SaaS apps in use to all of a sudden knowing I have 600 SaaS apps in use. There's nothing I can do with 600. Even if I devote a single day to each SaaS app, I won't have enough days in a year to get to 600. So, from Valence's perspective, I wouldn't think that you need to build 600 SaaS connectors, but where is that sweet spot? Like how much are you getting a sense for? Do you have to build for companies? Because there's going to be a long tail. Nobody's ever going to support the app that only a dozen people out there use. Where's that? Do you have a sense for where that sweet spot is and how far out we need to build?
Yeah, from what we see, there are maybe a couple dozen of core SaaS applications that are business critical that need coverage. Then there's a second tier of a few dozen that are important but not as important. And then there's a long tail of SaaS applications that you just want to know if the business users are using them. So I think what we'll see is that eventually a SaaS security platform helps you tightly manage and in-depth manage your core SaaS apps, provide you with proper security controls for your second tier, and helps you understand the usage and adoption of your long tail SaaS applications, and allows you through that to see the complete life cycle. But to your point about the frustration you mentioned from CASBs, is it has to be actionable and it has to be focused on
Right.
automation and remediation. Otherwise, you're just giving the security team another dashboard, and they have too many dashboards as it is. And they need actions, and they need the ability to show their peers and their internal counterparts, hey, we were here, now we're here, or now we're here, depending if you want to look high, if up and down is better or worse. But we were able to reduce risk using something and not just increase our risk.
Right, and I think that's an excellent note to end on there. Yeah, it's got to be something you can take action on. Yoni, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. Perfect.
Thank you for having me.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk securing edge computing with Theresa Lanowitz from AT&T and Chris Goettl from Ivanti. Cyber threats target digital identities. Do you know who or what is accessing your company's apps, systems, and data? You need to know who's there, who to let in, and who to keep out. And you'll need more than access management to stay secure. You need SailPoint Identity Security. As the leader in identity security, SailPoint can help mature your security resilience while driving efficiencies and compliance for your organization. Start your identity journey with SailPoint's free maturity assessment. Go to securityweekly.com/SailPoint to get your free identity security assessment today. Are you constantly thinking about how to keep your enterprise as secure as possible? Get to know Chrome Enterprise, the trusted browser for security-conscious professionals like you. Its ease of use for IT and security teams and added access controls protect the remote, extended, and hybrid workforce, keeping your entire enterprise safe. Don't settle for a browser that compromises your organization. Visit securityweekly.com/Chrome Enterprise now to learn more and start protecting your enterprise like never before. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. You can now find us on Instagram. Follow us for highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. That's @Sec Weekly. All right. This interview is sponsored by AT&T Cybersecurity. Theresa Lanowitz and Chris Goettl join us today to talk about securing edge computing. Theresa was an industry analyst at Gartner, launched the Gartner Application and Innovation Solutions Summit, and is now head of Cybersecurity Evangelism at AT&T Cybersecurity. Welcome to the show, Theresa.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here again.
Yeah, I should say welcome back, right? You were here a few episodes ago. Yeah. All right, and Chris has over 15 years of experience working in IT, hosts a monthly webinar focusing on Patch Tuesday and other vulnerabilities, and is the VP of Product Management at Ivanti. Welcome to the show, Chris. I'm not hearing you. I'm hoping.
Oh, yep. Sorry, I had my audio muted there. Thanks, Sam. It's great to be here.
I'm hoping Goettl is the right
Goettl,
pronunciation.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. All right. And so today we're going to be talking about securing edge computing. And maybe I'll go to you, Theresa, and let's just kind of redefine what edge computing is. I'm going to pull up the last episode we had just so we can refer people back to it, because we covered edge computing pretty thoroughly there, and we talked about the report that you guys released. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and give us a shorter.
Just so some, kind of a brief highlight on what edge computing is. And edge computing is one of those terms you hear all of the time, and everybody has a different definition. So for the purposes of the report that we wrote, we said edge computing has three primary characteristics: software defined, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud; that your workloads, your applications, your hosting, it's closer to where that data is being generated and consumed, so you can get that near real-time digital first experience. And then the third characteristic is that it's a distributed model of management, intelligence, and networks. So that's how, when I talk about edge computing, that's how I really frame the discussion around edge computing and what it is.
All right, and that episode number is 325. Where we last had you on and went over the insights report.
Yep.
All right, and Chris, how do you I know Ivanti, for people who don't know, maybe give us a quick overview of what Ivanti does. I was actually an industry analyst, I think, when it rolled up a bunch of different companies like Heat Software and I forget the whole list, but Ivanti is. If people don't know, does a lot of stuff these days.
Absolutely. So I would say one of the key things to kind of frame up what we do at Ivanti is we are helping organizations through their SaaS transformation. There's still a lot of technologies. Actually, the edge computing challenge is one that kind of focuses on the same thing. How do you go and expand your business out in a variety of different ways to better meet the market needs today? So whether it's, discovering and managing endpoints, being able to secure or remediate threats on those endpoints, or being able to understand the digital experience of your users and deliver better service and solutions to them. All of that is kind of what Ivanti helps do. And that intersection around edge computing is definitely a strong one for us. We partner with AT&T and provide a lot of solutions that help AT&T customers as well. And really, a lot of it is that being able to bridge the gap between on-premise and working through that SaaS transformation. A majority of the market is still right in the middle of that transformation.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so maybe, I think something that might help us here, maybe some examples of what edge computing looks like, what kind of devices, what kind of use cases. So whoever wants to run with that, I think that'll help us get a better grasp of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I'll jump in here with a couple of use cases. And I think it's so interesting because this whole concept of edge computing, it's the next evolution in computing. Computing started to become democratized from the time we had mainframe applications, and they were sitting in that big server room behind glass. And the moment we democratized computing and came out of that data center, we started to have evolution of computing. So PC, then we moved to mobile, cloud, web applications, and now we have these edge applications. And I think that these evolutions occur fairly quickly over time, and sometimes we don't even realize it. But if you look at some of these edge computing use cases, some of the big use cases that we got back from the people we surveyed in our AT&T Cybersecurity Insights report, one of my favorites is video quality inspection on the assembly line. So in a manufacturing facility, you're using a series of cameras and sensors to watch as whatever that product is that you're making be made. And so if there's some type of defect that enters in on the assembly line, they can stop that assembly line, pinpoint where the defect was actually entered, and be able to remediate. So what that does from a business perspective is it says it costs us less in terms of shipping bad products out to the market or possibly recalls, that sort of thing. So there's a big business outcome that these edge computing use cases help with. The other one I think that is really, really fascinating is using robots as an endpoint. So using robots in smart warehousing. So this idea of smart warehousing, being able to understand exactly what you have in your warehouse. And then once you start taking a look at some of the top use cases in different types of vertical markets, you see that manufacturing and transportation, they suddenly start to converge a little bit. Because one of the things that manufacturers are doing is they're saying, we want to use edge computing for smart inventory. We want to understand how much type of a good that we have on hand to be able to produce whatever it is we're making, whether it's clothing or cars. They need to understand how much of those raw materials they have on hand. And then from a transportation perspective, they always want to know where their fleet is. That was one of the top use cases in transportation. So, and a manufacturer wants to know how much of a certain material should I have on hand. And then once they ship that through their manufacturing component or arm or partner, they then want to know where is it in transit. Have the sweaters that I made, have they reached my destination in time for, the fall season when people are starting to buy sweaters? Where are the cars that I produced? Where are they en route to getting to the dealership so people can actually buy them? So you suddenly start to see a lot of these edge use cases converge. So there's some really, really innovative edge use cases going on, a lot of innovation happening through edge computing use cases.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of it's going to be more on the OT manufacturing side. I mean, it sounds like cars themselves, whether it's a commercial fleet or personal vehicles, would be considered edge computing devices, right?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, and I think you're right. There's a lot of OT convergence with IT, but also if you look at healthcare, for example, they're looking at things such as wearables for remote patient monitoring. So somebody has surgery and the physician wants to monitor their vitals. They send them home with some type of wearable watch so that they can monitor their vitals on a near real-time basis and being able to understand what's going on with that particular patient. Another interesting use case that we saw with healthcare was the use of robots inside of a hospital or a doctor's office to disinfect rooms between patients. So in a doctor's office, having a robot go in and be able to wipe down the exam table, or in a hospital, having a robot be able to go in and disinfect the room between patients. So there's a lot of really interesting use cases, but as you pointed out, there's a lot on the OT side, and that's what we found from our research as well, that there's a lot going on the OT side.
Can you help me to understand, I just heard what you said, and it's really fascinating, but can you help me to understand, so we know that this IT-OT convergence is happening. We also know that a lot of these OT devices are just not as manageable from a security side, but what happens like when you're in a patient environment? What happens when a doctor gives somebody who might be a Luddite one of these wearables? What kinds of risks are introduced? What kinds of risks are introduced when somebody, maybe they're tech savvy, but they're at home and now they're in an environment where they're connecting over who knows what? And then you're monitoring all this patient data, which of course is protected by numerous regulations and laws and all this stuff. So what's happening here? What do the risks look like? What can companies do about it, especially in healthcare environments, for instance, where security isn't quite as savvy as maybe some other fields?
Yeah, I think those are. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, I think this is definitely a key part of this transformation. Is we are pushing devices further and further out, so our attack surface is expanding. That attack surface is also changing. We're going from a lot more manageable devices to your point, OT devices are less oftentimes manageable. They have only certain things that you can do around that. So the way that we have to manage and the way that we have to monitor these devices really does change. More of what we need to worry about is around providing a good digital service as well. So to your, you made a point in there about some of these people might not be tech savvy. We have to make very easy to use devices that somebody's going to be able to interact with. Well, at the same time, they may be used without any interaction from staff at all. You could have a virtual kiosk for check-in, and there might be 5 of them out there, and it's 20 feet away from anybody in the healthcare organization, and they may not even know how to help you with that. So the ability to, first of all, secure those devices, because they're exposed in a lot of ways that devices typically weren't over the years, along with the fact that we have to be very aware and have much better self-healing capabilities built into these devices and experiences, has definitely changed. Attack surface management in general is becoming more and more of a critical challenge for organizations. Think about just this month, there was a vulnerability in WebP that basically affected every major browser out there, and it was actively being exploited. Organizations now have, a lot of them, I've spoken to a couple just recently, that have 48-hour turnaround times for remediating a vulnerability like that. We have to be able to identify, make decisions, and move quicker on security resolutions than we've ever had to before. And we've got the challenge of operationally putting devices out in an environment where the experience is even more critical than ever. If we've got somebody, so the healthcare use cases in the report talked about transitioning from consumer virtual care into more tele-emergency medical services. Think about all of the remote care options that people have today. If they have challenges just getting connected up to be able to access and get that care, that's going to be a significant challenge. So knowing more about that digital experience, being able to understand without having to have that person communicate with somebody at a support desk or a help desk to be able to get help is critical. So having automation, self-healing capabilities, and the ability to get telemetry off of a device to understand the overall experience and understand if that experience is degrading in any way and be able to respond quickly to that is definitely paramount.
Yeah, and a couple of things Chris mentioned, I wanted to just echo as well. The whole idea of simplicity is really critical. You mentioned somebody being given some type of wearable to go home with after surgery. And what if they are a Luddite? It has to be frictionless. So from a design perspective, from a software development perspective, from a connectivity perspective, it has to be very, very easy to use so that somebody, maybe after surgery, they're not feeling that well. In this example that we were using, you have to be able to have that simplicity built into that. And I think one of the other things that we're starting to see because of this, as Chris mentioned, we have all of these devices, all of these endpoints now out there at the edge. And that edge is wherever that client, wherever that customer, that consumer is using that endpoint or that device. But what it also really starts to say to IT organizations specifically is you have to start to work together. We've seen in IT over the past 4 or 5 plus decades that we've had these silos built up. We have our app dev team, we have our operations team, our networking team, our security team, line of business, and people in those different organizations, they pretty much tend to stay in those silos. So there's a lot more communication and collaboration that has to happen as well. And design does become critical. We all know that it is far more difficult to design something that is simple to use than it is to design something that's complex to use. And we have to go down that path of simplicity.
And Theresa, the problem is we're designing it simple to use, or trying to make it simple to use, while shoving more and more data in and through it, right? So it has to seem simple, but it can't actually be simple.
Exactly. That's the point, right? It has to seem simple, but it actually, when you pull back the covers, it's fairly complex. And, I think one of the greatest pieces of simplicity that we've all seen probably in the last couple decades is, take a look at when search engines were something that were brand new. We had a host of search engines out there that were cluttered with news feeds and ads and stock feeds and everything else. And along comes Google with their search engine, and it's pretty simple. There's just a search bar. Just type in what you want to do. And that is very simple to the end user, but beneath it all, there's a lot of complexity that goes on there. So I think that's a really great example of simple design.
So I want to shift a little bit, especially when we're talking about IoMT, the Internet of Medical Things technology, because we are talking about things like wearables. Obviously, there's a lot more than that. But when it comes to those types of devices, and even when you're talking about putting these in doctors' offices, and maybe you've got individual doctors' offices, they're not in a hospital setting, they don't have the IT or the security support, they're just individual offices that rely on technology because they're there and it's 2023. How does liability shift when we're talking about these different stakeholders, these different users, these different levels of people who may or may not have an understanding or even support for a lot of this technology? Is there some sort of a liability shift that's going on? I know what the regulatory environment looks like. It's not great. It's certainly confusing, but what are you seeing and what are you hearing when you're talking about the use of these things and supply chain on the tail end of it?
Yeah, supply chain becomes a... Go ahead,
Theresa.
No, I was just going to say supply chain becomes a really interesting component of that because you can't necessarily control everything. So you have to have that relationship within your supply chain. And, we've seen different types of legislation come out, different types of guidelines and rules that say if you're deploying these IoT types of devices, you cannot deploy them with the factory set password. And in many cases, the manufacturer will not even allow you to deploy with the factory set password. So there are things that are happening, I think, across the suppliers of all types to really sort of limit the risk of something happening.
Yeah, and I would say there's definitely a lot of additional complexities happening with any organization's choice in a vendor. So we've seen a increase in the complexity of vendor risk assessments going on. The number of vendors that you're onboarding in an organization now really matters more than ever. We've got companies who are coming to us saying, hey, I need to figure out how to go from 50 vendors down to 35 vendors this year. What can you help me to consolidate there? And one of the major drivers for that is just all of the overhead that comes with interacting with each of those vendors. From a supply chain perspective, not only do you have that medical device, but you've got everything that device has to interact with. There's an entire ecosystem there, from the discovery of a device, implementation, all the things it interacts with. You may not even be able to manage some of these devices directly. So we have a partnership with a vendor called Scenario. This is a really good example in the healthcare world, again, where medical devices, to preserve their FDA approval here in the US, they need to stay configured exactly the way that they've been approved to run. So that means you can't get in, manipulate, and lock things down in all sorts of different ways. It has to be exactly the way that it was approved to run. So what that means is you need to protect at a slightly different level. So a vendor like Scenario knows how that device should be configured, and they can look at that aspect, but they can also protect at a slightly different level. So north, south, and east, west traffic interactions with that device are where we have to protect a lot of these edge devices, because they can't be directly managed, either because they limit the amount that you can interact and configure them, or because they have specific requirements that you have to meet to be able to even run that device. The privacy aspect is definitely challenging on top of that as well. You've got more and more increased kind of scrutiny over what a device is collecting. The types of, every time I do a product release on any of my product lines now, I have to go through in-depth questionnaires about what's all being collected, how is it used, is there any telemetry being pulled on that? If there is it being anonymized? How is it being anonymized? And even if you've met all those requirements, a customer could come in and be like, no, you need to explain it all to me, or I'm not going to buy this product. So it has gotten infinitely more complicated as this evolution has been continuing.
And there's some interesting challenges there, right? Like I presume, like the early example of the cameras on the assembly line, latency, it can be a difficult challenge for some of these devices. As you add encryption and resilience and stuff like that, oftentimes latency is impacted. And also talking about how a lot of these devices are consumer facing. Again, you've got usability requirements and ADA and accessibility requirements and things like that. That kind of limits some of the stuff that you can do. How does somebody type in a password if they can't type, right?
Yeah, so a lot of go ahead, Theresa.
Go ahead, Chris. No, go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say, yeah, the different types of assessments like that are even down to geographical levels. So the U.S. has their version of those types of criteria. Canada has theirs. The EU has theirs. Different parts of the globe each have their different requirements on that. They're mostly very similar, but you may even have to go through and get certified down to those specific labs who approve that you've met those criteria. So are you providing a user interface that can work for somebody who's blind, who's deaf, who's unable to type? All of those things are definitely driving a lot more complexity for the vendor who needs to deliver it. So to Theresa's earlier statement, like, we need to deliver something that looks simpler, but under the covers, it's definitely a lot more complex to deliver start to finish.
Yeah, and what I would add to Chris's comment is, again, the whole idea of tearing down those silos that have been built up and really expanding that team, because now you have to have people on your team who are really design focused. And probably in the past, you may not have had those people who are specifically design focused. And those designers are looking at everything from the user experience to accessibility and so on. So the the removal of those silos is really important, but also expanding what that team looks like to actually put a product or a service or an offering or some type of edge computing use case to market. That it really starts to change and shift.
Let's talk about that for a second. I know it's sort of out of scope of the report, but it's a really important point, Theresa, because you keep bringing up the idea of eliminating these silos. And so we've been talking about it for years. It's becoming more and more important. We're seeing some of these things happen, but in your experience, in your your ability to talk to so many customers and people in the security and IT world, what are some of the strategies that are working best for that? Because we do still have that natural friction between security and IT. But as we were talking about before, it's not just about security and IT. It's about business stakeholders. It's about users. If we're talking about the medical field, it's about doctors and nurses and technicians and admins. And how do you break down some of those barriers in a world that looks like 2023 with some of the current distributed networks, distributed devices, IoT, IIoT, OT, IOMT, all the acronyms? How do you do that?
Yeah, you're right. We have been talking about this for years. I can remember when I was an analyst talking to clients, and they're saying, we have this development team and we have this operations team, and they have similar goals, but they have competing priorities that they have to get done. The same thing held true for security. So we've been talking about it for a couple of decades, at least, as far as I can tell. But one of the things that we started to see in 2022, when we were doing this AT&T Cybersecurity Insights report in 2022, is we started to get some comments back from people who were saying, there's a need to sort of erode the silos. There's a need to be able to have the application development team work with a security team, for example, or to have somebody from the line of business really be very clear about what it is the business outcome wants to be. And I think there are really two ways that we start to see these silos start to erode. And unfortunately, in one case, it's if something bad happens, if there's some type of event that causes maybe a cyber incident, if there's some sort of, app that doesn't do something, that doesn't perform well, you suddenly start to see from the top down, the organization being really mandated to say, you teams, you need to work together better. And that's an unfortunate situation, but the byproduct ends up being pretty good because you start to erode those silos. The other is that you have a really innovative leader who really understands the necessity to work cross-functionally. And if you have that innovative leader is really saying, all right, security, you're part of everything we're doing. You're a business requirement. You're not just a bunch of really smart people sitting off in the corner somewhere by yourselves and telling us when something bad happens. You're part of our overall business plan or business strategy, and it's a business requirement. So having those innovative leaders really understand what is going on, if you do have those silos, I think really goes a long way in starting to eradicate that. And, it's behavior that we have had inside of IT organizations for probably since the 1960s. So it's behavior that has been ingrained in a culture over a long period of time, and it does take some time to overcome it.
Yeah, and I think Theresa's taking Theresa's comments a little bit one step further. Like I spent a lot of time in my career more in the vulnerability management and patch remediation side. That's an area where you absolutely have to have security and IT working together. But Theresa's point of two teams with similar goals but different mandates is very accurate. Security is focused on reducing risk to the environment. IT is their primary goal is keeping the environment operational. Now they're having to work together more than ever. So one of the things that I really liked about the Cybersecurity Insights report this year was the seeing how many of the organizations that were going through a lot of those edge computing transitions had from the get-go included security from the planning stage all the way through execution. So I think whether it's talking to organizations about their vulnerability management challenges or seeing how they're managing their edge computing projects, we're seeing that transformation happening more and more, which is a great sign. The point of nothing can get delivered in the digital world now without taking security and privacy into account it's a simple fact. So if those teams aren't collaborating, that organization is going to find themselves in hot water very quickly.
So you bring up privacy, which was actually perfect, because that was the crux of my next question. In the last couple of years, we've really seen privacy requirements just come almost out of nowhere. Like it's moved really, really quickly, I feel like, to where even having somebody's email address, and not just for consumers but enterprises also. We also have the converging effect of double, triple ransomware, where if there's any employee data stolen from a company getting ransomware, they're going after employees as well. And anything they can use for leverage on employees, I think is just helping a lot of the privacy legislation go along even further. How much of a challenge has that been for this kind of thing with a lot of these edge devices, tending to store and gather personal data, stuff that would be covered by some of these new privacy laws and requirements?
Yeah, that's been an interesting evolution. Seeing, think about a tablet in a hospital that you're using to check in, or even like most corporate buildings, you're going to use a tablet at the front desk to be able to check in for an appointment with whatever company on whichever floor. You're putting personal information into that experience. Between you and the next person stepping up to that device, the requirements now from a privacy perspective are very particular about making sure that needs to be wiped. Most of the hardware manufacturers and tablet manufacturers didn't really build in great experiences around that. A few years back, more and more we're seeing, like Apple and Google especially, having to deliver much better capabilities at the device level, so that your MDM solution can go in and be able to make sure that between user sessions that nothing remains in there that could be captured or used or escape from that experience and become a PII issue. So that absolutely has been a significant evolution in the past 5 or so years in the market. It's one where there's continued kind of expansion of what those privacy laws are going after. I think your point about the double or triple methods of ransomware attackers to leverage, pressure on their victims, being able to steal the data, not just encrypt it, and then be, using that in different ways to try to leverage a ransom out of that attack, is a great example of why these privacy laws are continuing to expand and need to evolve. But yeah, it's definitely presented a huge challenge. It's presented a challenge from everything from the hardware level to the different software and applications that are running on these devices, and having to account for the edge computing use case pushes that boundary even further. You don't know how many people are going to come into contact with that device. You need to make it easy for the user to enter in information that can be captured and then, transmitted to the backend system, whatever it might be. If I'm doing a check-in, if I'm, entering information for some type of form, to maybe purchase something at a digital kiosk or something like that. All of that is information that's captured, needs to be secured, and then wiped from that user session so that somebody else couldn't capture it.
Yeah, and I think what Chris is really starting to allude to is we really have to start to take a look at the data lifecycle. Does the data that we are capturing now through these edge computing use cases, is that data protected? Is it trusted data? And then is it usable by whoever or whichever entity needs to be able to use it? And I think the whole conversation around privacy is really, really interesting. AT&T recently did a survey in conjunction with The Economist, and there was a big article that was published about a month ago on it. And it was along the lines of how people are looking at privacy from a biometric standpoint. And it's interesting that we as human beings, kind of where we draw the line on privacy, because the survey that AT&T and The Economist conducted was really looking at the use of biometrics in terms of being able to board a plane faster. So being able to have an airport, being able to have TSA, have your biometrics, and you being able to get through a security line much more quickly because your biometrics are stored. And what they found out in this survey is that a lot of people are just saying, oh, just wait a second, I'm not really willing to give up that much of my privacy. So it's really interesting where we as human beings really start to draw the line and say, enough is enough. We're willing to give photos of our vacation and, children and relatives, and be willing to give out your mother's unmarried name on social media. But they're kind of drawing a line on privacy in terms of biometrics. So I think that's really interesting. And a human's reaction is also going to cause some of these technologies to succeed or to fail or to require, more security built into things.
Yeah, one thing I saw, an interesting topic I saw a while ago was the idea, and I think this might have more traction in some other countries, not the US, maybe not Europe as much, but the idea that like healthcare specifically, that the individual has control over their data, and instead of me having to pay $10 to get my college transcripts or my medical history from my general care provider, instead I'm the one that owns it, and I lend it to them when I go in to get like a doctor's checkup or something like that. The ownership kind of shifts, and like there was a lot of bluster and hype around blockchain being used for it or something like that. But the general idea being that the individual becomes more in control of their own privacy, their own data. But on the flip side, what we saw with cryptocurrency and a lot of these things is individuals aren't very good at protecting that data in terms of availability. Losing hundreds of Bitcoins ever. Like everybody's got a story about the hundreds of Bitcoins that were on a hard drive. They can't remember where it is now. And, imagine that's your medical records, right? And they've got to be rebuilt from scratch or something like that. So is there still anything going on there? Any interest in that? Or was that just an idea that kind of fizzled out?
I mean, I think that's still really looking at the data lifecycle. How does the data lifecycle work? What is your role in your protecting your own data? We've like you mentioned, we've seen that happen in other geographies, and so it might be something that's taking hold in other geographies more so than the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think from a technology perspective, it's kind of one of those where having the right technologies in place is one thing, but then having agreement on how it's all going to work is going to be the other. So really, it's kind of that progression, that digital life cycle, that data life cycle is progressing towards like having your own identity wallet. What do you all have in your wallet? You've got your social security number or personal identification number of some sort, your driver's license, your transcripts, your healthcare records, all these other things. One of the biggest challenges with this trying to get to that next evolution is to get everything to the point where it would be in even conceivably a handful of wallets is going to be a significant challenge of getting everybody to standardize on one way of doing things. Like, is everybody going to agree that blockchain's the right way and this is the technology to deliver that? And it's definitely something that people are desiring and wanting to strive towards. But I think we've hit a technology barrier on trying to get there because there's so many different ways currently on the table to try to tackle that. You could have government level identity wallets, and then you're going to need one for your healthcare system. And then if you're crossing over healthcare systems, do you need two? Are they going to standardize and collaborate to make it one type of system? I think there's definitely a desire to get to that level, because I think it will give us a different level of digital freedom when it comes to everything personally identifiable. But there's a few technology hurdles to go there. So the hype cycle was really, really moving fast, and then slowed way down, and I think we're waiting to see when or if it'll pick back up in a significant way here.
Yeah, it seems like technically, your Apple Pay, Apple Wallet, Google Wallet, like that stuff is kind of ready for this kind of thing, but maybe it's more regulatory stuff and
right.
The process is like I don't think the U.S. healthcare system is ready for the individual to control their own medical records.
Right. Yeah. Even for something like filing our taxes, almost every state does things a little bit differently yet. So it's the credit card systems and the pay wallets are the example of how it could be. But seeing this trickle out into the highly regulated, yeah, I think you're spot on there with that's going to be the leap. Can we make that technology leap with getting everybody to collaborate, work on doing things the same way?
Yeah. So talking about like consumer devices, does passwordless come in at all here? Where more and more, we've seen people's personal smartphones be an important element in, I don't know if that counts as edge computing, but how people authenticate with things and maybe even extending to their smartwatches at this point, which are also more and more 5G enabled, where, you can leave your phone behind and you still have always on connectivity to the internet to do pretty much what a phone can. A lot of smartwatches are just a small phone now. How is that kind of evolving with, because I know, Chris, you mentioned MDM earlier, like that was a very sticky situation. I remember personally running into one company I worked for, put MDM on people's personal phones, and a few people's phones got accidentally wiped, and they were not syncing their photos, and they lost a bunch of family photos. They're upset. And then the whole attitude in the organization about MDM just changed immediately, and everybody said, "No, if you want me to have email on my phone, you can give me a corporate device, and I'll just carry 2 smartphones with me."
Right. Yeah, I think the phone is a great example of where we start to see a lot of these collisions really start to pick up. We saw some of the phone vendors, the Android system really got good at having the enterprise versus personal separation on their devices, so that your MDM managed device can have the corporate side be wiped without affecting the personal side of it. So some of the time, these technologies, if we don't have the ecosystem working together, both the phone manufacturers making the capabilities and the separation work correctly so that the MDM vendor can do their piece and the end user gets a single device that they have to carry around, we end up with a lot more complexity and resistance to adopting technologies. Like, I wouldn't want to carry 2, phones around, because most phones nowadays are not small, right? Having to juggle 2 phones constantly and be tethered to both devices for both personal and work is challenging for a lot of people. So yeah, I think the evolution has gotten there where more of these devices are now friendly enough for that BYOD use case to be more effective. But it's interesting to see where some of these devices using passwordless. We do have a passwordless authentication capability with our MDM solution. It makes it so that the user has their phone becomes their password basically. Now I can authenticate and get that push notification or scan a bar or a QR code and authenticate to whether it's a cloud solution or whatever else I might be logging into. As long as I've got my phone, I've got my authentication. I don't have to remember a password, and I get a much better overall experience, because the number one attack against mobile devices yet is still to try to capture user credentials. So implementing something like that can absolutely remove one of the biggest security threats to that type of device and to the end user. We can't take the limits of humans out of the equation. They're never going to remember passwords. So trying to take the password out of the equation is the only way we have left. So it's definitely something that can drive a much more effective experience. But you're right, using a technology like that making sure that you've got that separation between people's personal lives and their corporate lives is very much important.
Yeah, and I think that multi-factor authentication is really, we're going to see more and more of that required. And it's interesting because, here we are, end of September, next month is October, so Cyber Awareness Month. And I was reading some of the talking points on what we're doing this year from an industry perspective on cyber awareness. And they're talking about multi-factor authentication, but they're also talking about stronger passwords. So it's just interesting, I think, that so many of us are saying, passwordless is probably the way to go, using multi-factor authentication, maybe with something such as biometrics and so on, because you don't have to remember anything. But yet here we are in 2023, and we're still very much concerned about passwords and the strength of passwords and the ability for passwords to be compromised, through stolen credentials. And then you also look at, Chris mentioned the number one sort of threat to mobile devices is that sort of stolen credentials. Then you start to be able to see things like account takeovers creep in, where somebody can impersonate somebody from a company asking for large sums of money. So we see these types of things in the types of attacks that are going on in the wild on a regular basis. So I just think that it's still really interesting that here we are in 2023, and we're having this conversation still about passwords and the strength of passwords and how to maintain them. And should we go passwordless, or should we kind of stay with a password?
Yeah, fascinating. Well, a lot of fascinating stuff in this conversation today. Thank you so much, Theresa and Chris, for joining us today on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, we covered a lot of great ground here, and make sure you visit securityweekly.com/AT&T Cybersecurity to learn more and grab that 2023 AT&T Cybersecurity Insights report on the edge ecosystem that we've been alluding to and somewhat referencing throughout this conversation. We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news. Do the words free time or relaxation sound foreign to you? Perhaps you've been stuck in the office too long, battling cyber threats or worrying about the next strain of ransomware. Let Sophos help provide peace of mind 24/7, 365 with cybersecurity delivered as a service. Because we want you to get back to your weekends, family dinners, and everything in between. And you'll get there with Sophos. Visit securityweekly.com/Sophos to learn more. If you work in security or IT and your company has Okta, this message is for you. Imagine a world where only secure devices can access your cloud apps. In this world, phish credentials are useless to attackers, and you can manage every OS, even Linux, from a single dashboard. Best of all, you can get employees to fix their own device security issues without creating more work for IT. The good news is, you don't have to imagine this world. You can just start using Collide. Visit securityweekly.com/Collide to watch a demo today. That's securityweekly.com/KOLIDE. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Join our Discord channel to chat with our host, ask questions, customize live stream alerts, and more. Visit securityweekly.com/Discord to receive an invite. Also, if you go to any place where we're streaming live and you type in comments like in YouTube or Twitch, we will also see that in our Discord. And the things we type in our Discord, you will also see back on Twitch and YouTube and all those other places. Because it's all tied in and we have really smart people that make stuff like that work. Now, for the Enterprise Security Weekly news, we're changing up things a little bit today. We have a guest co-host here. We have Allie Mellon from Forrester. Hello, Allie.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So you've been on a tear with your blog posts. You posted something about the Cisco acquisition of Splunk. And we talked a bit in depth about your the blob that's poisoning the security industry post has elicited some responses from the industry, let's say. So it made sense to have you come on and to chat about that stuff. So that's what we're going to kick off today.
Awesome. Happy to hear it. Yeah, it's been really it's been a busy couple of weeks. There are always, when it rains, it pours in security, right? Absolutely.
Especially with those kinds of, with the stuff going on, like, we didn't know Splunk was going to happen. It's that's the fun part of being an analyst. Some of my favorite days were writing up acquisitions and doing deal analyses. Like I remember one year where on September 1st, there were 3 major acquisitions announced on one day, and it was a Monday. Oh, and it was a very crazy day.
Yeah, that's a crazy day.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, just to kick off here, let's start chatting about the Cisco acquisition of Splunk, biggest acquisition they've ever done. And if we're not mistaken, we were thinking on this last week. We think it's the biggest cybersecurity deal ever. Is that correct to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, it is. Nothing offhand that I can think of was bigger than this one. This is definitely a huge acquisition, and I mean, it's also a huge inflection point for the SIEM market as a whole. I mean, this is a massive shift for so many of the clients that I talk to, so many practitioners. It's a pretty wild time, just given the scale of Splunk's user base and also just how dedicated they are, in particular at the practitioner level.
And there's, of course, the joke going around that the reason, the rationale for this acquisition is that it was cheaper than paying the Splunk bill. It was Splunk really worth this much money, do you think?
I mean, they made the deal, didn't they? If that's not a sign, then I don't know what is. But no, you're totally right. I mean, cost is the number one issue that I hear the most about with Splunk. The only thing second to that is a lack of innovation, to be honest, over the last 4 years. So it is a little surprising from that standpoint, because I do see practitioners who are kind of frustrated with Splunk from that cost standpoint and the lack of innovation, but still they have a really strong hold on the SIEM market. I talked about this in the Forrester Wave that I did on security analytics platforms. By far the biggest vendor in this space when it comes to just user base and fan base. So it's a big win for Cisco in a lot of ways, so long as they are able to approach it from the right standpoint, which kind of we'll see.
All right, Tyler, any? No,
you're wondering if we lost Adrian for a second there.
I was thinking surely somebody else is going to chime in here, so I'll just shut up.
And therein lies the problem of only one person on the screen. Now we have a 4-up, much easier to see each other. Allie, I do have a quick question. I have also heard a lot of mumblings and grumblings post-acquisition about Cisco becoming the new IBM. And what I think is being said there is that that Cisco is the place where good products go to die or dead products go to rot. However you want to state that. Now, I don't know that I believe it, but you're going to have a lot more insight into, I think, some of the products and strategy from Cisco and where they're going than someone like me who's disconnected from their day-to-day. Can you give a little bit of commentary and color on the indirect answer to that question? I don't need you to say yes or no, but give me an idea of where you think the broader strategy for Cisco is headed, and is this something that they're going to be able to leverage well?
Cisco's made a lot of acquisitions in security. They've made a lot of acquisitions overall, of course. Not all of them have been successful, to be honest. And there have been some that have lasted, like Duo Security is a great example of this. They've made that one work. But I think that practitioners have a right to be skeptical right now and have a right to be concerned and be very wary about the situation with Cisco. Now, the way that Cisco can get this right is by giving Splunk the freedom and the ability to continue to do what they do really well, which is make a very flexible offering that's valuable for clients. I think the biggest thing they need to focus on for customers, the biggest things they need to focus on are speeding up innovation and addressing the cost problem. If that's something that Cisco can bring to the table while still making sure that Splunk is able to deliver the way that they have in the past, that would be a huge win for Splunk customers as well. The biggest problem that I see is that there are a lot of security teams that just don't believe that that is going to be something Cisco is able to do, and they're already looking at alternatives. So Cisco has a long way to go to prove that they are able to handle this acquisition and that they're able to keep this product at the level of what practitioners expect and want it to deliver. And if they're unable to do that, it's going to be an enormous shift for the SIEM market.
Yeah, and then what about strategically how it fits in? I feel like there's, and we've talked about this on the show, and I think you probably, actually, I'm pretty sure you listened to last week's show. I'm positive you listened to at least some of last week's show, where I made a fair amount of commentary about kind of this new center of gravity about large data sets and AI overlay on top of some of these large data sets. Is this the large data set or potentially the large data set infrastructure? Is this acquisition their version of that and remaining competitive in that storyline against the greater players like whoever, my brain is broken because I'm sick today, but Google,
Microsoft,
and
Palo Alto,
Snowflake,
CrowdStrike,
and
all over. Players. Yeah.
And
no,
Wiz
1,000%.
That's what I was trying to come up with.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, what's interesting is Cisco, so they had an XDR a couple of years ago. They recently relaunched their XDR offering. And one of the things that's happening in the XDR market right now is we see a lot of XDR vendors who are acquiring some type of log management offering to be a SIEM replacement or a SIEM alternative. CrowdStrike's an example of this, SentinelOne, Cybereason. They've all done this. And then we see with Palo Alto, for example, them developing XIAM. Many of the vendors are trying to find an alternative to the SIEM, both for their own service that they're delivering and then also to sell as a product as a SIEM alternative. And Cisco needed that in some form. And so while this is kind of a surprising acquisition from that standpoint, just because it's Splunk and it's such a big and well-known brand in the security industry, it absolutely, from a strategic perspective, is a piece of the puzzle that they needed, that they now have, and that they need to incorporate and sell with their XDR offering so that they can have both pieces of the puzzle. The issue with the XDR market right now is that data is residing in XDR and it's residing in your SIEM, and it's costing you for both. And that is frustrating a lot of CISOs in particular. And so by being able to buy both from one provider, you can have the data stored in one place, but still accessed for the quality of detections that XDR gives, and then do all your other SIEM stuff in whatever SIEM replacement the vendor's offering.
Yeah. One of the cool things about doing a live show is that you get to make blunders and you have excuses. So last week I made a blunder about SentinelOne, and their wonderful AR person who I've known for over a decade reached out to me. I was like, you are wrong. So I wanted to kind of throw this out there because it's directly to the point that you bring up. And I hadn't really thought about it, to be honest with you. So last week I said that SentinelOne doesn't have a good database or set of a data spot or a SIEM equivalent or a SOAR equivalent, something that kind of anchors the center of that data collection system that they can then layer AI analysis on top of. It turns out they do. I think they did an acquisition of Humio, I think it's called. I'd have to check my notes.
No. So CrowdStrike acquired Humio and turned it into
Here I am blundering twice in 2 weeks. It's CrowdStrike, not SentinelOne.
SentinelOne is Scalar.
Yes.
Which is now Dataset.
But to wrap it all together, they all have their own versions of this, which I find very interesting. Turns out I'm not as connected into the endpoint EDR, XDR side as I wish I was. But is there really a world where the data set of EDR and XDR merges with the cloud and infrastructure data set in a way that becomes a kind of a one ring to rule them scenario? Or will these two worlds stay separate and we kind of have two data planes? Like that's what they're telling me, is that they think that this stuff merges. And I'm not fully convinced that the user base, the use case, the data set, the AI overlay, the detection algorithms translate between the two. Of course, I generally don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm not convinced. So.
No, I think it's a great question. When you are talking about cloud data, are you talking about from a cloud security perspective, or are you talking about SIEM and the data that you're bringing into the cloud SIEM?
I'm more talking about infrastructure information, cloud-centric event information. So it does have some SIEM storyline, right? But it's also the asset information, the context around what exists, the state of the assets in the environment, kind of being one picture and one dream. And then the XDR picture has always been a separate dream to me. But, within the last week, I've started really getting beat up that, hey, this is actually a singular dream. And I'm kind of interested in trying to figure out how that works.
Yes, absolutely. So from a detection and response perspective, absolutely, yes. It is. I mean, EDR vendors have been able to succeed because the endpoint is where attackers are targeting, because that's where the data has been. That's different now. The data's in the cloud. Attackers are now targeting the cloud. If EDR vendors want to continue to be a very large part of detection and response, they need to have a way to do detection and response in the cloud. We already see this with MDR vendors, especially. Many MDR vendors are starting to do detection for things like CloudTrail logs, because that's ultimately the next detection and response detection surface that they're looking at. So I do think that as a natural shift with XDR, approaching the cloud as another detection surface is a key part of that. That said, when it comes to things like asset data, misconfigurations, that type of thing, that's where you kind of get more into probably getting into something around like vulnerability management and some of the security engineering, architecture pieces, which as someone who focuses in detection response, I really want very little to do with. It's important, it has to be done, but I'd much rather focus on figuring out what the attackers are doing right now.
Well, I think that's the R. Sorry, Adrian, I'm going to cut you off. I know I told you in back channel to take the next question, but I'm going to cut you off. I feel like Kanye West at the Grammys. I'm going to cut you off now, Adrian. No. So the R, though, is response. Doesn't that infrastructure context speed up response, right? Because if you think about a response profile and a response process or workflow, event comes in, mapped to a vuln, whatever, vuln discovered, event comes in, however you want to look at it. You need to go get a whole bunch of context, from state context to code context to, individual HR context. All that context kind of wraps together to make the R part of EDR, XDR faster. So wouldn't that context be an enrichment button that could help across the board?
Definitely. Absolutely. It should be enrichment for an incident that makes sense for that particular incident should be included, just like it is with EDR and with traditional infrastructure. Not saying that it's always done well, because it's not, unfortunately, but that context can help so much and becomes even more important in the cloud because there's so much more going on, and it's so much of an unknown to many security operations teams who have so far really passed that back off to the cloud team. Gotcha. But right, I want to say that like that doesn't mean that the XDR provider should be the one that's gathering that data, that owns that product. This is the same thing. This is why we have like a separate VRM tool, even though many don't want to, is because ultimately there are different specializations and you can't necessarily have your detection and response vendor knowing everything that there is to know about vulnerability management. So there is an important separation of duties here and separation of users that are using the actual tools. But from an enrichment perspective, for sure, anything to help out the analyst experience is really pivotal.
Yeah, right a boom and left a boom, right?
Yep.
So my first question: why Splunk with all the other ones that were potentially on the market here, right? Like they could have paid less for a Devo or less for a Sumo Logic. They wouldn't have got a SOAR tool with it though. So I don't know how important SOAR was also in this deal. But why? Yeah. Why not? A separate. Why not? What is the one that everybody's nuts about now? Why not Tynes plus Sumo Logic or something like that?
I would suspect it's likely around completeness of offering and what they're able to provide from that standpoint. They're not going to have to catch up to the rest of the SIEM market. They will be ahead of most of the SIEM market, which is not going to be the case if you go with any other vendor, unless they were to come along and buy Microsoft, right? So ultimately, like there are limited options for them in the SIEM market that have the breadth and depth of capabilities that Splunk is able to deliver because of how long it's been in the market, because the community around it, they get a lot when they're getting Splunk. They get the user base. The community is a huge part of that I think is the biggest advantage that Splunk has had. And beyond that, they also get a lot of really strong talent. I mean, I was talking about this the other day. They just hired pretty recently a new CTO, Min Wang, who worked on Google's AI assistant for 5 years before coming over to Splunk. She's brilliant and will be very beneficial for them on the generative AI front, which is something that they stressed throughout the press release for the announcement of the intent to acquire.
Right. Yeah, and I imagine you're talking about the customer base. I imagine Splunk's revenue is quite a bit larger than a Tynes plus a Sumo Logic would have been, so
no kidding.
They're getting a moneymaker also.
Yeah, no doubt.
So they get the moneymaker, they get the industry leader, but as the industry leader and one of the oldest SIEMs on the market, there are also these legacy problems that everybody talks about, and users 100% feel locked into Splunk because of, myriad reasons, right? Just moving off of SIEM is not, piece of cake. So do they also risk sort of this complacency because they're buying the so-called market leader and they don't really have to push innovation because of that? Or does this give them the opportunity? Because you've got some of those smaller players who may be more innovative, don't necessarily have all the capabilities yet, but don't have the legacy problems. So there are pros and cons to this. The worst thing that happens when a company buys another company, especially a big player, is that they don't start pushing boundaries. That technology goes somewhere to die. And then you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of customers out there using this technology that's really ineffective, but they can't easily get out of.
Oh, there are definite pros and cons to this situation. I'd say that most of the pros are coming up Cisco here. Most of the cons are potentially coming up for customers of Splunk. That's my big concern. And that's why, could they become complacent with this acquisition? Absolutely. It would be very reflective of some of their history around acquisitions. that is the thing that they are going to need to avoid doing if they want to keep the user base that Splunk has, is to make sure that they are promoting innovation and make sure that they're pushing the product forward, which requires a ton of investment. It is not something that even if you just let it sit on its own, it would be able to manage. They need to take a very different approach here and also let Splunk continue to be Splunk if it's going to succeed. And beyond that, they can't just stop there. They also need to make the case for why customers should even stay. Because most of the clients that I've been talking to they've been trying to look at alternatives to Splunk for a long time because of the cost. And this acquisition has given them the kick in the pants to say, okay, let's actually start looking seriously at some of these alternatives, because we know Cisco as a hardware company. We don't really know or trust them as a software/security company.
What are some of the, I don't want to ask you about specific companies because I know that's not what you do, but what are some of the capabilities, what are some of the innovations that you're finding that customers are asking about, that they're really looking for when it comes to, because it's not just SIEM anymore, there's this whole ecosystem, you focus very, very heavily on XDR, and that's an adjacent area. It's not this standalone, we have the SIEM, we're running a great program now. So what are people asking about? What are they interested? Obviously, generative AI is becoming part of it.
Yeah, so my focus isn't just XDR. I actually focus on security operations holistically, which includes people, process, and technology. From a technology perspective, it's XDR, it's also EDR, it's SIEM, it's SOAR, and it's security analytics. I've done waves on EDR, XDR, and security analytics platforms, which is, for Forrester and Forrester's definition, the combination of SIEM, SOAR, threat intelligence platforms, and UBA, user behavior analytics. So very familiar with the SIEM market and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. The biggest things that came out of the wave evaluation that I did on security analytics platforms, which of course included Splunk, among others, including Sumo Logic, Devo, all of that. Hello, what are you doing, Kat? Say hello to Luca.
Hello.
The biggest thing that came out of that evaluation was this comment that ringed very true to me at the time and still does, which is every single customer reference I interviewed, and I typically interview 4 to 5 per vendor as part of the evaluation. Every single one, when I hopped on the call, they said, it's like any other SIEM. You got to put in a lot of work to get value out of it. Did not matter which SIEM they were talking about, did not matter what type of company they were talking about, same problem every time. And so when I talk to clients about what they're looking for from their SIEM, they're looking for something that takes less work. That is ultimately what they're looking for. And that comes from multiple angles. It comes from the analyst experience angle, as far as what is actually done in the offering to speed up detection, investigation, and response, and to do that holistically from both the SOAR side and the detection piece. It also comes from the standpoint of, are my log collectors working? Are my integrations for SOAR working? Do I have all of the integrations that I need? Because that's another big piece of this that's often missing. Or they just don't know and don't get alerts when a particular log collector or integration isn't working, which is even worse because you don't know what you don't know. There's also the aspect of this around detection, which takes a lot of work to tune, takes a lot of continuous work to build new detections. How can we make that more effective and reduce the amount of work that teams have to do there as well? Those are just a couple of the angles, but by far the most common that I hear about. A lot of it is the work that we have to do around maintenance, and then the work that we have to do for actual detection and response.
It's amazing how little things change. Back in 2004, when I first bought a SIEM, we had 4 different companies compete and do a proof of concept. Each one had a week to do their proof of concept. And the one we ended up buying was the only one that they were able to get working within that week time frame that week.
Oh my God.
They literally brought in their own hardware with it pre-installed. Like they had all the prep time, like they could have had this just ready to go. Brought it in, 3 out of the 4 couldn't even get it up and running to where they could ingest any of our data by the end of the week.
Well, this is the really funny thing because we talk, and I'm going to bring in the blob now. We talk a lot about capabilities that vendors.
We need to shift there anyway because we're running out of time.
Okay. Yeah. We talk a lot about the capabilities that vendors are able to provide through the tools. But when I'm talking to CISOs, that is just one of many things they care about. I usually end up bucketing it into 3 different parts. Capabilities, yes. Features, super important, right? Can you actually do the thing that I'm looking for the tool to do? But when it comes to making a buying decision, there are 2 others that are way more important and can affect the decision way more. Dependencies. How many people do I need to use it? Where is it deployed? How easy is it to use? What do I need to do to get it working? And then lastly, time to value. How fast can I get it up and running? Do I need this today or do I need this next week or next month? What does my timeline look like? How long is it going to take me to do something like convert all of my Splunk queries over into this other SIMS query language? Those pieces come into play here as well. So we focus a lot on the capabilities, but that
now, right?
What?
I've seen that's a use case I've seen for ChatGPT is converting query language from it. Like it actually knows because it's consumed their whole API documentation and their query documentation apparently.
Which has so much potential because I get this all the time from a vendor lock-in perspective for queries and for playbooks. And so if you're doing playbooks as code and you can easily translate them into whatever other representation that other SOAR vendor has, it'll save so much time and make that migration process so much easier.
Yeah, so I did have another question, and maybe you can pull it into the blob conversation, but it seems like, ChatGPT is one example, but there might be some opportunities here to kind of decouple and lessen some of the lock-in that we see from vendors. I know the technology's out there to where maybe I don't have to store all my data with a cloud SIM. Maybe they can. I know the technology is there where they can just use and consume the data where it sits. Like maybe some of my data is in an S3 bucket, some of it is sitting in Snowflake. I've got a bunch of different data sources. Do you see that happening where maybe a disruptive vendor comes in and says, you know what, bring your own data source. Like we're not going to charge you for storage. We're just going to provide the analytical engine, and your data can live wherever. And you find cheaper storage, great. Use that cheaper storage. Like it might impact some of the performance, but at least it lessens some of that lock-in, right?
Oh yeah, you are right on with this. That is such a great question. Vendors like having to ingest all the data because they can charge for all the data, right? They like having it in one place. It's an easier architectural problem. It's an easier technical problem, but CISOs don't love that. They don't want to be moving all this data around, especially when they're in a multi-cloud world, which is the reality for most security teams, most enterprises generally. Things like federated search or even just the federated access of that data within other data stores is gaining in popularity. We see this already with a number of MDR providers. I usually look to services providers to see where the product is going to go next and where the product equivalent is going to go next. And there are a lot of security teams that are interested in taking that approach of, can I keep the data where it resides and just access it for detection and response as needed? For most vendors, they're in earlier stages of this. Like you can, if it's different instances of their own offering, you can access it. Some are further along than others. If it's a completely different third-party product or data store, then they can access it as well. But there's a lot of drivers here from end users to have some type of alternative that's able to address that. Just like you mentioned, there are some performance issues. It's pretty technically challenging to get that to work as quickly as you can if you're just ingesting all of the data and then going from there. But at the same time, you have some delays on ingest anyway. So it's 6 of one, half dozen the other in many ways.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, did you see Ross Halleluch's post on LinkedIn the other day talking about the future of analysts?
I don't think so.
It kind of pairs into this blob conversation. Basically, he was saying, There's a lot of smart people with blogs out there, so the role of the analyst is going to be lessened in the future. And I kind of
oh yes, I did see this.
Yeah, I kind of thought he was actually countering his own argument, because he listed like 8 or 9 blogs. I was like, I don't have time to read 2 or 3 blogs, much less 8 or 9. Like to me, that's just more information on my analyst to ingest and analyze so that they can save me time, right? Yeah. And kind of cutting through the blob, that's going to be part of it. Are some of those blogs corporate blogs also? Like how much do you have to read between the lines? There's just I think it's more necessary than ever.
So I have a question, Adrian, about the blob, about exactly what the blob is, because I've done a little bit of homework since my off the hip shots last week. And I love the concept, right? So things the blob might say: SIM is dead, AI solves the detection problem, EDR coverage is enough, you don't need detection if you have good prevention. But what's disconnected from reality is that what they're selling there, what they're pushing there, does not match what the demand of the practitioner really wants is, right? And my question to you, Ali, is I agree with you 100%. Like, the blob is just spewing whatever's going to sell, right? That's 100% what they try to do there, whatever's going to hook. But isn't just the basic concept of what a market will bear and what they will and won't buy going to be enough to solve the blob problem? Inherently, what I mean by that is, if I go out there and I put out words like "you don't need detection if you have good prevention," and then they get hacked, right? The market will eventually come around to, yeah, you do. In the short term, it may be painful if they fall for that garbage that people are spewing. But doesn't the market have the ultimate say by just not buying? Right, buying exactly what they do want? Aren't they the power piece in this discussion?
So in a perfect world, absolutely, they would be able to do that, right? But the problem is that this actually, there's a disconnect here where we think, or I guess the security industry and vendors think, that what they are saying is effective and is causing people to buy, when in reality, at the enterprise level, it's not. It's not what's being said is not actually what's causing people to buy. It's the CISO or the security team going and putting in all of the legwork to actually understand what the product's capable of, digging behind all the BS that the vendor is saying. And so there's a ton of work going on in the back end by the CISO and by the security team to sift through, okay, I see 16 buzzwords, which one's actually relevant to this particular vendor? That's where the problem comes into play. Vendors can get such an advantage if they just stop doing this, but it's often a self-feeding cycle.
And let's say hypothetically 10% of CISOs are also advisors or investors in vendors. How big of a problem is that?
What do you mean? How big a problem is that?
Right. Well, the performance of the product is not the only incentive, right? Like if I'm buying a product, I'm also an investor in, right? Like, I'm seeing that more and more and more. I'm seeing VCs that have these huge CISO panels, a lot of CISOs working as CISOs, but also investing in products that they use within their company. So I worry there that there's incentive to look the other way on performance, on issues, on stuff like that, because they have other incentives in place. It's no longer.
I can put a little bit of color there for you too. The best of the best recuse themselves from making the buying decision in that case, right? And there are plenty that I've worked with that do that. But the bigger problem I see are these larger syndicates of angel investors or groups of pre-seed investors that are 20, 30, 60 CISOs that come together, invest $5 million amongst them into a pre-seed product, and then proceed to everybody buy it, right? Now, yes, again, there's plenty that will recuse themselves and say, I'm going to let my team make the call. Yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down. But if you don't think that stuff filters back indirectly through other channels, like it does happen. And that I think is also a blob problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think that it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's something that comes up in my conversations with CISOs a lot is, where can I actually talk to someone who uses this product? Because they'll introduce me to a CISO who is one of their customers, and it's just somebody who's on their advisory board or somebody who's invested in them, and they're just saying all the nice things about the product. So it is a self-inflicted wound to a certain extent when you have CISOs who are continuing to push that same message, even when it's not accurate and they know it's not accurate.
Yeah. Yep. All right, we've only got a minute here. Anything else, Allie, you want to cover before we let you go?
I think we covered a lot of ground. Thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure. I did watch last week. I really like your show. So thank you so much as always. It's great to talk to you all.
Yeah, so cool. Thank you for coming back on.
If you want to hang on for 30 seconds, I'll go ahead and read us out here. So we do have some news stories queued up. If you want to check those out, you can go to securityweekly.com/ESW333. Those are all listed there. There's some funding, there's some acquisitions, there's some good essays, some new products to check out there. A great rant on very bad security awareness companies, and even a squirrel story about LinkedIn getting really weird. People oversharing on LinkedIn. That's a fun one. Number 18 there. Thanks for everybody watching or listening today. Thanks so much, Katie, Tyler, and Allie for joining me today. And it's been a great conversation. Thank you.